Right, right. So, what do you say to someone that says, well, should we really even focus on the nuances of expiation versus
Mm.
propitiation? Because they do have a little bit of a nuance, but in the way that they could be presented, even in the Greek, ex meaning out of, and the pro meaning for. Is there really truly a difference when the New Testament, and from what I can see in the Tanakh, it really truly teaches that one would come to pay the debt. So is there really a difference truly in
I
these
think
words?
that both are found in the Bible.
Mm,
On the one
right.
hand, there is the need for expiation, which basically means cleansing. And this is the Hebrew word kippur, which is the um, concept of atoning or
Mhm.
purifying or cleansing of sin. And it comes to its ultimate expression on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement.
Mm.
Uh, and so for Old Testament Jews, expiation was extremely important because the sins and impurities of the people had to be cleansed in order for a holy God to live in their midst, in the
Yeah.
tabernacle and later in the temple. But at the same time, it's clear that there also is a propitiation of the wrath of God.
Right.
And I take that to be the emotional or affective counterpart to the justice of God. In the category of legal theory, the
Ah,
justice of God needs to be satisfied. There must be just retribution for sin, rightly deserved.
right.
And God's justice in the legal realm is expressed in the personal realm by his wrath upon evildoers for the wrongs that they have done. And the sacrifices, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, serve this twin purpose of expiating sin, cleansing of sin, but then also propitiating God or satisfying God's wrath and justice.
Wonderful. Okay, wonderful answer. I really like that. I think there's a lot to chew on there. So hopefully a lot of
Yes.
my viewers will definitely consider that. Why is this something that I think people need to be aware of, that a human is kind of dualistic in this
Mhm.
regard? And how does it apply to some of the subjects that we're discussing with atonement?
Well, with respect to being created in the image of God, according to Genesis, it is the image of God that sets us apart from the other animals. And if we are purely physical or material beings that do not have a rational soul, then we are no different from animals. And therefore, I think that it is inherent to man's being created in the image of God, and therefore being intrinsically valuable, is that man have a rational soul and therefore be a person, just as God is personal. To be in God's image means that we are persons in the same way that God is personal. And so, dualism, having a rational soul, I think is inherent in this notion of being created in the image of God and human worth and dignity and human rights. At the same time, I would add that if we are just material objects, just bags of chemicals on bones, then everything that we think and do is determined by the input of our five senses and our genetic
Mm.
makeup. There would be no human freedom and therefore no moral responsibility. We would not be moral agents who make significant moral choices. We would just be basically moist robots,
Right.
as
Yeah.
determinists have put it. And so I think that the soul is vital for having freedom of the will and being a moral agent. And then one other final thing I might mention is related to the resurrection that we just said.
Mhm.
Before Christ returns, what happens to those who die? Do they just go extinct? Are they just wiped out? Well, not according to the Bible. According to the New Testament, the dead in Christ continue to exist as disembodied souls. They go to be with Christ, where they await his return and the final resurrection of the body. And so apart from that intermediate state of the
Mhm.
soul without the body, it's very difficult to make sense of the resurrection. Without that intermediate state of the soul, what you would have is God creating duplicates of us when Christ returns, but they wouldn't be the same persons. They wouldn't be the same people that actually committed the sins or that uh, had certain loves and activities and desires. They would be just duplicates of those persons. And that's certainly not what the resurrection of the dead means. In order to preserve personal identity from the
Mhm.
earthly life to the new heavens and the new earth, the resurrection life, we need to have the soul to bridge the gap.
Interesting. I think that is a subject that kind of opens the door to the ideas of like reincarnation. And I think this
Mhm.
is where it would take a person who's like, this is a good study subject. Also, I like that you make mention that if we're just, like you said, chemicals doing this and that, we have no moral standing with God where we can just, hey, well, we're just chemicals. Remember, God, we're just chemicals. We have no moral agency. So I really like that. I took away a lot from that, and hopefully
Good.
some of my viewers did as well. Um, I like that you mentioned disembodied mint, right? So it's taking us right into the next question. Do you believe that Jesus died in the spirit? Because we're talking
Oh.
about this body soul dualism. Do you believe that Jesus died in the spirit and body, or only body?
Mhm.
Is this important in light of First Peter 3:18 and 19, when it says that he was made alive in the spirit? Now I can read that if you'd like me. I can pull it up, or if you're familiar, you can
I'm
just
familiar with it.
okay,
Yes.
wonderful.
That's an important verse about Christ's intermediate state between his own death and resurrection. What happened to Christ during that intermediate period before he was raised from the dead? Jesus didn't die in the spirit, he wasn't extinguished as a conscious person. But what does death mean?
Mhm.
Human death means the separation of the soul
Sure.
from the
Mhm.
body. When we die, our souls are not extinguished either. We don't become extinct,
Oh,
our souls persist. So, human death involves the separation of the soul from the body. And Jesus Christ did experience that in his death on the cross. And during that interim period between his death and resurrection, the New Testament hints in various places that Christ descended into the abyss or into Hades, which is that interim holding place of the unrighteous dead until the day of Christ's return and the resurrection of the dead. And so I do think that Christ was active, conscious, um, during that intermediate state between his own death and resurrection, just as we will be conscious and having fellowship with him during that intermediate state between our death and our resurrection.
gotcha. So whenever you say this holding place, is this just a place for the evil, or is this also like an Abraham's bosom place
Uh-huh.
for? Yes. Okay.
In the Old Testament, these two realms of the dead are not clearly distinguished. It simply talks about Sheol,
Hmm.
which is the sort of nether realm of the dead where the departed spirits went.
Hmm.
But with the development of Judaism during the intertestamental period between the Old and New Testaments,
Yes.
Jewish thinking came to differentiate Sheol into paradise for the righteous dead, and then what's called in Greek Hades for the unrighteous dead. And you find that also in the New Testament. Think
Hmm.
of uh, Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where Lazarus dies and goes to Abram's bosom, as you say, which is paradise. But then the rich man dies and he goes to Hades, where he's in torment. So there is a differentiation. And Paul talks about the dead in Christ being away from the body, but at home with the Lord in 2 Corinthians 5. And in Philippians, he said, I would rather die and go to be with Christ for that is far better. So this interim state of the righteous dead is a wonderful state of closer fellowship with Christ, though it is not a completely human condition because they are disembodied. They look forward to and long for their resurrection bodies.